in Latin America and the Caribbean building better school systems in the wake of the pandemic will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email this previously mentioned address and contact the subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you're finished speaking. Consistent with H.R. 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. Good afternoon, and thank you to our witnesses for coming and testifying before our committee today. A defining feature of the COVID-19 pandemic was its ability to worsen social issues that predated it. Latin America and the Caribbean nations have struggled against a legacy of educational scarcity, stagnation, and inequality. While some countries have made significant strides towards universal access to education, literacy and dropout rates in the region were trending in the wrong direction before the first case of COVID-19 was detected there. The pandemic brought about an unprecedented disruption of the region's academic institutions, interrupting the education of nearly 200 million students. Latin America and the Caribbean had longer school closures than any other region in the world, due in large part to limited resources and inadequate capacity to adapt. Students were lucky enough to access virtual education, still lost out on critical face-to-face services such as school meals and access to social support and mentorship. Those who reside in rural areas, live with a disability, and face economic adversity are now at heightened risk of falling out of the system entirely. The long-term impact of this could be devastating. According to the World Bank, pandemic-related school closures in Latin America and the Caribbean could have nearly 2 out of every 3 students incapable of reading and writing at grade level, and nearly 80% have already fallen behind on basic foundational skills. In the absence of interventions to make up for lost instructions, this generation of students will not be prepared to participate in the modern economy. A recent study estimates that current students in the region could lose out on $1.7 trillion in future earnings. Without the prospect of economic mobility, more young people would turn to gang affiliation, informal employment, and migration to our southern borders. Further, they will be increasingly susceptible to online disinformation and political radicalism. Long before I was elected to Congress, I taught teenagers at Memorial High School in West New York. Over half of my students were free lunch eligible. A third spoke English as a second language, and many of them, including myself, by the way, and many of them had endured financial hardships from the early age. As a teacher, I saw firsthand the impact that a student's environment has on their ability to learn. I can only imagine how difficult it is to navigate these challenges in isolation, or to attempt to reach students through a screen. The immediate sweeping effect of the pandemic on education in Latin America and the Caribbean is a wake-up call for many who are focused on the region. However, the repercussions of this crisis can be mitigated with a recognition of the problem that were present before the pandemic, as well as an acknowledgement of our past failures to provide equal access to quality education in the region. It will take a coordinated international effort with support of the United States to move beyond confronting the damage done by the pandemic and take on challenge of building better education systems in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are lucky to have the opportunity to learn from experts who can illustrate the scale of the problem and provide us with recommendations for supporting student achievement across the Western Hemisphere. I will now recognize Ranking Member Green for his opening remarks. Congressman Green.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chairman Suarez, and to all of our witnesses for being here today. 2 years following the initial outbreak of COVID, the facts about the coronavirus and its implications are well known to each of us by now. Unfortunately, though, instead of following the science, as was the quasi-religious motto over the last year, it is a sad fact that both the United States and Latin America, school children are paying the price for radical policies. This is despite new guidance from the CDC that disputes the narratives many people took as gospel truth since March 2020. Many were so determined on silencing any and all dissent that even data-driven arguments from physicians like myself urging schools to reopen were summarily silenced. What's even more absurd is, as the performance numbers of our children have fallen, and with a FOIA evidence that the CDC worked with the liberal teachers' unions to keep schools closed, the liberal media is trying to flip the narrative and say that it was Republicans that closed the schools. Americans are not buying that lie. As I know everyone on the subcommittee and the full committee would agree, our most valuable resources are young children, the future generations. One of the most tragic ways in which this mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic has continued to hurt America and her allies is the mass closure of schools and institutions of higher learning. In fact, according to the United Nations, after only 2 years of the pandemic, 7 of 33 Latin American nations are operating at full and in-person capacity. We shouldn't be surprised then that school completion rates in Latin America have plummeted from 56% to 42%. This is a tragedy. For the next generation comes after billions of dollars of U.S. spending in development aid and vaccine assistance worldwide. The story's the same here at home, though. American schools saw a disastrous 12% decline in middle school reading comprehension. Likewise, math and science comprehension reached an all-time low. In my home state of Tennessee, there's been a shocking 50% decrease in proficiency rates for reading and a projected 65% decrease in math. A report from Vanderbilt University found that student chronic absenteeism significantly increased, with nearly 1 in 4 students classified as chronically absent. Even this crisis, though, pales in comparison to the mental health crisis facing our children. As reported by the U.S. Surgeon General, suicide attempts by teenage girls rose by a shocking 51% during the closed schools. A quarter of all young people in our nation have recently experienced symptoms of depression, and a fifth have symptoms of anxiety. Despite these shocking metrics, Democrat dogma has continued to impose lockdowns and performance efforts like masking that have zero effect on public health in that population. The problems are endless, and our adversaries know this. The Chinese Communist Party is taking full advantage of the virus that it unleashed on the world to influence institutions of learning, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Since 2006, CCP-sponsored Confucius Institutes have developed a substantial presence in 23 Latin American and Caribbean nations and continue this expansion at an alarming rate. There's an extremely troubling trend that as more Confucius Institutes emerge in the Western Hemisphere partner nations, the CCP gains an ever larger footprint and influence on our partners and allies' economic and foreign policies. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru each have a strong Confucius Institute presence and are becoming increasingly economically dependent on China. Clearly, the CCP doesn't let a tragedy go to waste. I'm glad that my majority colleagues have a concern for students in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is a concern that I share wholeheartedly. As we've discussed in this committee countless times, a free and prosperous Latin America and Caribbean is clearly and transparently in the interest of the United States. As Chairman Cirrus and I have stated together before as we were unveiling our Western Hemisphere nearshoring bill, preserving and building upon the prosperity of our neighbors to the south is a key first step in solving the migrant crisis at our southern border. It is an extension of this very same effort to improve the education outcomes for Latin America and the Caribbean students and an absolute imperative for this subcommittee. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses today on how we can rebuild these education systems and overcome the setbacks of the past few years. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Green. I will now introduce our witnesses, Mr. Leandro Folgar. Leandro Folgar is the president of Ceibal, Uruguay's Education, Technology, and Innovation Agency. He leads the Ed.D national strategy and faced major challenges during the COVID-19 crisis. He earned a BA in Education from University of Universidad Católica de Uruguay and a master's degree in Technology, Innovation, and Education from Harvard University. A former Fulbright student, entrepreneur, and business consultant, he began his career in education as a teacher and has more than 13 years of experience in different school positions. He is passionate about technology, the evolution of education, and its influence on the future of our global society. Mr. Forgard, we welcome you to the hearing, and I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Folgar, you are recognized for your testimony. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes. Thank you, Chair Cirrus, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished members of this committee for the invitation to make a statement as a witness in this session. Building better education systems in the wake of the pandemic has been a goal for Uruguay and Ceibal, besides the topic of this hearing today. Ceibal's most recent claim is learning from the future because it is part of our DNA to innovate and ensure that education technology is equitably distributed in our country and education system. The organization's commitment as Uruguay's Educational Innovation and Technology Agency to providing access to connectivity and technology plus meaningful pedagogical approaches during the pandemic has been total. These facts generated that the regional community in the southern cone of the Americas and the Caribbean reached out to us to complement their education efforts during the pandemic. Furthermore, the international community and multilateral development organizations have recognized the good results in Uruguay despite the unprecedented negative situation generated by the COVID-19 pandemic and school closures. Ceibal's experience in Uruguay allows us to observe the capacity that public policies can have when it comes to reducing the digital gap, boosting the quality of learning, and promoting the educational continuity. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Ceibal's technological solutions allowed schools to implement distance-blended emergency teaching learning models with flexible dynamics and adaptable to various contexts. In 2020, its virtual teaching platform reached 88% of the students and was positioned as the 5th site with the highest number of visitors in the country. However, the participation of students in this period had differences. Some gaps became more profound, and new ones emerged. This reality was even worse in other countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Ceibal's team's experience with innovation and practice trying to solve complex problems with imperfect technologies for more than 13 years was one of the many reasons why Uruguay was able to offer learning continuity during the school closures. And it was also the main reason why the organization experienced one of the best cycles of internal innovation in its history. Ceibal created new software for learning, adapted its infrastructure to help Uruguay become the only country in Latin America with a public education system both online and offline, and provided the real-time data that informed the early reopening of schools when it was safe. Ceibal made the Uruguayan educational system more resilient. So how to build sustainable, resilient education systems in the region is a challenging, complex question that has been taking on considerable significance since the outbreak of COVID-19. Having flexible education systems that can be remodeled at a pace consistent with the changes we are experiencing and can withstand the different disturbances that may occur is a current challenge in which technology plays a key role. Technology is not a solution for education, but there is no future in education without technology. Having or providing education systems aided by technology with quality infrastructure and solutions means providing more students with an education that is more accessible, sustainable, and less prone to interruptions. The pandemic has shown that those who purposefully use available technology for education do better than those who don't. It is essential to contextualize solutions and understand how countries make technology available and what type of technology is used locally. Promoting technological infrastructure to enhance learning will depend on each country's possibilities, reality, cultural relationship with the technologies, and available talent. It is an ongoing process that calls for a systematic investment strategy and improvement of technological capabilities. Ceibal created the Ceibal Foundation, which seeks to strengthen digital education policies in the region as part of its mission, promoting research, innovation, and dissemination of projects on technology and learning in collaboration with the national and international academic education community. The foundation coordinates the Alliance for the Digitalization Education in Latin America, implementing the Rural and Inclusive Digital Education Project in Honduras and other countries of the Caribbean. Both initiatives are funded by international cooperation funds and collaborate with UNESCO in their effort to monitor the education goals for sustainable development related to the proper use of technology. Ceibal is open to collaborating with the international community, and this is why this hearing becomes so relevant for us.
Thank you very much. Very impressive what you were able to accomplish during these difficult times.
Thank you.
It's a lot to be said for a stable country. I will now introduce Dr. Fernando Reimers. Is that correct? Okay. Dr. Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of Practice of International Education and Director of Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. An expert in the field of global education, his research and teaching focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so they can thrive in the 21st century. He was a member of UNESCO's Commission on the Future of Education. He is a member of the Advisory Committee of the UN Education Summit. He has also developed curriculum aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals used in many schools throughout the world. During the COVID pandemic, he led numerous comparative studies examining the education consequences of the pandemic. He has served on the Harvard faculty since 1998. Previous to that, he worked at Universidad Central de Venezuela, the Harvard Institute of International Development, and the World Bank. Dr. Reimers, we welcome you to the hearing. I ask the witness to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, you are prepared. Your prepared statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Reimers, you are recognized for your testimony.
Chairman Cires, Ranking Member Green, and members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I appreciate the invitation to testify before you at this hearing on the educational impact of COVID-19 in education in Latin America. I will summarize from my written testimony and structure it in 5 sections, about a minute each. The effects of the pandemic on education, pre-existing educational efforts prior to the pandemic, the impact of COVID-19, the education silver linings of the pandemic, and the bumpy road ahead and opportunities for reform. In Latin America, the education effects of the pandemic were particularly harsh given the long duration of school closures and the deficiency of the alternative means that were used to teach remotely, especially to reach all children, the children of the poor, and also because the economic and health effects of the pandemic increased the vulnerability of disadvantaged students and their families. As a result, the pandemic undermined much of the educational progress achieved at great cost in Latin America over the prior decade in improving access to school to the most marginalized and in supporting their learning, and it undermines the future economic prospects of large segments of the population, aggravating pre-existing social and political challenges. Students in Latin America experience the brunt of 6 mutually reinforcing challenges: the longest school closures, the lowest levels of resources and institutional capacity to mitigate learning loss, lower levels of access to vaccines, the greatest increases in poverty, lowest effectiveness of alternative modalities to education, and the greatest pre-existing levels of social and educational inequality. The recently released Human Development Report shows declining measures of life expectancy, education, and income per capita since 2020, wiping out gains made between 2016 and 19, and shows that those declines were the greatest in Latin America. It's important to recognize, however, that prior to the pandemic, education had come to be seen as a path to increase the opportunity of the children of the poor, to reduce inequality in what are the most unequal societies in the world. Education gave hope to those less privileged that the lives of their children could be better than their own. Over the last quarter century, a number of countries in Latin America had increased the priority given education, and as a result, preceding the pandemic, Latin America was investing more on education as a share of government spending and as a share of GDP than any other world region. And education spending had increased over time. Not only had Latin America increased the level of education spending, but it had also increased spending on poorer students through a variety of innovative targeting mechanisms. As part of this societal commitment to education, many governments in the region undertook reforms aimed at elevating education standards, increasing the years of mandatory instruction and increasing the levels of the curriculum, improving teacher preparation, increasing school autonomy, and improving educational management and accountability. Efforts to achieve those goals included not only those of governments at the federal, state, and municipal level, but also efforts of many different actors of civil society. For example, ambitious efforts to overhaul the curriculum in recent years include reforms in Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. As a result of these efforts, mandatory instruction in Latin America now covers 9 to 10 years of schooling, including primary education, which is compulsory in all countries in the region, and lower secondary education, which is compulsory in all countries except Nicaragua. Upper secondary education is compulsory in 12 of the 19 countries in Latin America. And these changes increase the levels of education attainment of the population. Latin America has achieved almost universal attendance to elementary and lower secondary school, while the number of children out of school declined from 15 million in 2000 to 12 million in 2018. The greatest levels of exclusion are in upper secondary school. Now comes COVID. And when COVID was recognized as a pandemic, governments in Latin America ordered the suspension of in-person instruction as part of the efforts to contain the spread of the virus. I will skip this part of my testimony because I think Chairman Sayers has synthesized it very well. We completely agree on the facts. And so let's talk about the silver linings of the pandemic. It shouldn't be surprising that the pandemic produced an educational calamity, arguably the worst crisis in the history of public education. After all, shocks of varied sorts, such as natural disasters or conflict, typically interrupt the functioning of schools and the lives of students, negatively impacting their learning. What should really surprise us is that during a global crisis of such magnitude, there would be so much interest and effort to sustain educational opportunity. In particular, international development organizations and civil society demonstrated extraordinary leadership, maintaining attention on the importance to sustain education during a crisis, a reminder of the important role of international cooperation to advance progress and peace, especially in challenging times. The United States Agency for International Development, for example, pivoted some existing education programs and created new programming to support education in priority countries in Latin America, focusing on the educational opportunities of the most vulnerable students. Such responses have relied on multi-sectoral partnerships, bringing together governments, universities, and civil society. Similarly, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF have demonstrated exemplary leadership, advancing the importance of maintaining the priority for education and providing policy guidance to governments and providing financing and technical assistance. All of these generated an innovation dividend which we must study and which we must leverage to address the road ahead. So during the period between April 2020 and June 21, my colleagues and I in the Global Education Initiative have been studying those innovations through 3 studies which are described in greater detail in my statement. And so, let me just skip ahead to talk about some of these innovations. In spite of the variation in the region, most of these innovations recognize the importance of addressing the education of students beyond foundational literacies. We learned in the pandemic that nobody learns very much when they are in fear, and that we must address the emotional needs of students so they are prepared to learn. For example, Fundación Súmate in Chile, a network of second chance schools for school dropouts managed by the Hogar de Cristo, prioritize and develop very effective programs using WhatsApp to support the emotional well-being of students. In Colombia, the Alianza Educativa, a network that works with 12 high-poverty schools in partnership with universities, developed printed materials to support distance education during school closures. Enseña for Colombia, part of a network operating in 70 countries, akin to Teach for America, also showed the power of network of schools. We're going to go. May I just move to the conclusions and just say one paragraph in the concluding statement? So let me just talk about the bumpy road ahead. The pandemic created an education crisis in Latin America, which robbed many students of the opportunities to learn what they were expected to learn and caused them to lose skills they had already gained. It also pushed some students out of school. Those losses affected primarily the most vulnerable students. This is going to complicate other societal challenges which presented the pandemic, such as the challenge of increasing productivity, reducing poverty and inequality, increasing civic cohesion and trust in institutions and democratic governance, and addressing issues such as climate change and intra and interstate violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now introduce Gabriel Sánchez Zinny. Mr. Zinny is the Managing Director of Blue Star Strategies, LLC. He's also a Senior Advisor to the CEASE Project on Prosperity and Development and a member of the Inter-American Dialogues Program on Innovation and Technology in Education. He served as a Minister of Education of the province of Buenos Aires. He held the position of Executive Director of the Assessment Unit of Education Quality of the City of Buenos Aires and the Executive Director of the National Institute of Technological Education. He co-founded 2 social impact initiatives, EduNexo and CUOPA. Sí? Gracias. Working on the introduction of technologies in education system. He graduated as an economist from the Universidad de San Andrés and completed a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University. Mr. Zinny, we welcome you to the hearing. I ask the witnesses to please limit our testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record.
Yeah. As an Argentinian, it's an honor to be here today in front of you and this House of Representatives. As you know, education in Latin America and the Caribbean was already in crisis. The pandemic made it worse. The region suffers the greatest inequality in the world, beginning with inequality of opportunities to access a good education. 50% of students do not finish high school in a timely manner, and the region ranks last when measured against international tests like PISA or TIMSS. The pandemic aggravated this, resulting in 3 million students dropping out of high school and dropping out of school, according to the World Bank, and never returning to the classroom. Poor educational assessment results were surely due to the length of time schools were closed and the lack of connectivity, particularly in the most vulnerable communities. In addition, it has become clear that online learning is not a sound replacement for in-person education. This dynamic appears to be widespread, as the latest national assessment of educational progress shows that US student performance have also suffered for the same aforementioned reasons. This tragedy seems to be getting worse, but it should also bring about opportunities to overcome ongoing challenges in education. First, we have an opportunity to give visibility to the educational crisis and to understand from a foreign policy perspective that education in the region is key for the US. not only because education increases the odds of socioeconomic success and a more stable citizenry, but also because a prosperous Latin America and the Caribbean means more trade, less forced immigration, and the economic consolidation of the continent vis-a-vis the growing presence of China. There are so many issues that we include in foreign policy discussions, such as geopolitics, trade, transparency, and institutions. But we must also include human capital. We must give it the necessary relevance and include it in all multilateral and bilateral conversations. We must focus on the skills and abilities necessary for a thriving democracy and boost economic development. The accreditation of university and postgraduate degrees between and among countries and the mobility of talent in the hemisphere need to be key foreign policy issues moving forward, keeping in mind that remote work and the possibility of exporting education has generated enormous changes and opportunities in the education sector. Secondly, we have an opportunity to dare to advance with more audacity and a sense of urgency around necessary reforms in the region, including improving teaching careers and measuring performance more effectively, evaluating schools and teachers in modern ways, generating precise information systems, and building a better transition from high school to the working world. Third, we have an opportunity to build on lessons learned regarding online education. While technology cannot replace face-to-face schooling, it is true that the pandemic has familiarized the entire educational system with this powerful tool to strengthen learning, especially for the most vulnerable students who generally do not have access to the best educational content and teaching methods in person. But to harness online learning to help students make genuine improvements, governments and the private sector must work together to invest in the connectivity of schools and families. The experience of the pandemic has shown even more clearly that we all learn in different ways, at different rates and with different interests. Along these lines, it could be helpful if the government in the region institutionalized changes that give more freedom to educational offerings, from homeschooling to secondary schools with elective subjects and credits. Educational offerings continue to be very rigid in Latin America and the Caribbean, ill-suited to individual learning needs, and disconnected from the profound changes that the pandemic has exacerbated in the labor markets. Simultaneously, the prolongation of the closure of schools had led to greater participation of families and more active social demand from them when it comes to their children's education. This is a positive phenomenon for the region, where governments and trade unions organizations typically dominate conversations around education. We must continue promoting the participation of parents, making quality of learning a priority among the demands of citizens who want politicians to invest in education more seriously. We should also encourage citizens to demand that governments provide more information on how schools are progressing and how students are performing, while making it easier for parents to understand schools' curriculum contents. Finally, we have seen another positive trend toward greater autonomy and empowerment of schools, which, due to either government action or lack of thereof, have been able to make more and different kinds of decisions around student learning, and have been encouraged to innovate and experiment with new ways of reaching their students. This positive trend could be replicated and cemented as the norm if governments better define institutional frameworks with more freedom for schools and teachers, who can do what they know best, to teach, with less rigidity and fewer regulations from the central ministers of education. In conclusion, while the pandemic has revealed and sometimes worsened educational challenges in Latin America that have existed for years, it has also widened the possibilities for changes that will benefit students, families, teachers, communities, and societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now turn to questions. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Forgard, this goes to you. I listened to your statements very attentively. And it's obvious to me that Uruguay made pre-existing investment in remote education before the pandemic. So how much did that help? And did you have enough money to do this, which is always comes down to money?
Thank you, Mr. Cires. Yes, actually, Uruguay has been making a sustained investment in technological infrastructure for 15 years now with the creation of Ceibal, this organization. And no, it's never enough money invested in this infrastructure because it is a perpetual challenge to make technological infrastructure available for every student, high quality technological infrastructure for every student. We know that technology is evolving at a very, very high pace, and trying to make this technology available for every student in the country is a big challenge in terms of its investment as well. Right now, Uruguay has invested around $700 million in the creation of this infrastructure during these 15 years, and it's true that this infrastructure was of paramount importance to have the results that we had, but it was not only the money, but the way in which the investment was made to make it sustainable in a country with the income, the GDP that we have. It's not the same financing matrix that more developed countries can use, and that's the interesting thing about Uruguay. We found a model in which we can make cheaper technology work for us in a good way for our educational system to be online as well.
Great, terrific. Dr. Reimers, this is for you. One of the concerns that I have with students spending so much time on the screen, how susceptible are they to political extremism? How susceptible are they to be influenced, obviously, by what's going on out there in the world?
It's a very important question because, as you know well, by all indicators, democracy is under siege everywhere, including in some of the oldest democracies. And it is under siege by extremist groups of various sorts that essentially prey on the ignorance of the population. And so I think we should be very concerned about education taking a back seat in the wake of this pandemic and disinvesting in the development of the capacities of people to discern facts from fiction. I do think that there are two things that make people susceptible to become hijacked by extremist ideologies of any kind. One is ignorance, is a lack of opportunity to be educated. And the second one is, of course, spending a lot of unsupervised time on various online environments. So I think it's very important to learn the lessons of history. The Federal Reserve produced a very good report on the consequence of the pandemic of 1918 in Germany, which through mechanisms that had to do with the reduction of municipal spending in education and health, threw a lot of people into despair and made them very susceptible and prey of individuals like Adolf Hitler, who were totally marginal individuals at that time and who 15 years later became elected chancellors of Germany. I think it's very important that we continue to prioritize education, and an education that cultivates human reasoning. I just spent a little bit of time on the Library of Congress, visiting Jefferson's library. And it's so clear that the Founding Fathers understood that democracy is a twin institution with public education and with public research universities. And I hope we don't forget those lessons. So I'm so grateful to see a former teacher, such as yourself, calling attention to the importance of education at this time, not only to advance human well-being and the capacity of individuals to become architects of their own lives, but to retain the capacities that make it possible for them to collaborate with others in a world where we're all fundamentally equal in democratic societies.
So I assume from what you're telling me that we should be really focusing on more policing on what's going on some of these screens to see the content that's there.
I certainly think we should be developing a media literacy of students and developing their capacity for rational thinking, their capacity to understand the difference between fact and fiction. And I think that our teachers, both in the United States and in other countries, do a very good job when they have access to the students, teaching them digital literacy, which is an essential foundational skill in the 21st century. I think that should be the priority. We also should be paying attention to what goes on online, and I think dialogue with technology companies is essential to make sure that they all behave responsibly, understand that they have a public trust and that they should sustain. They have a public trust in creating these modern cyber spheres that bring people together and that can be used for good and for bad, as we know, sadly. In the old days when people met in the physical public square, there were always some individuals that were a little bit odd and crazy, but they were isolated. But these people now can find each other, and they can create a virtual universe where they can spread their lies and misinformation and hijack others. And whether those individuals are extremists like Al-Qaeda and similar groups, or the groups that are trying to undermine American democracy, it's all of the same ilk. These are people who are challenging the very idea that we're all equal and that we're all capable of collaborating with each other to build a society where we recognize that basic equality of individuals. I think those are very serious risks for American democracy and for other democracies around the world.
Would you like to add something to that?
I agree that critical thinking is key, and an ability that we should teach in our schools, and a dialogue with the private sector. Technology companies have an important here responsibility as well. It's important to have a continuous dialogue with the government.
In Uruguay, do you keep an eye on what's going on?
Yeah, we do. We have a whole department in Ceibal that is working in digital citizenship and global citizenship skills. It's on the ranks that Fernando Reimers was sharing. We believe that the students, their families, and the teachers need to have tools to actually curate the content and use it in ways, proactively in ways that they can, let's say, apply all the possibilities of their digital citizenship skills and make them an extension of their citizenship in general and the rights.
You know, obviously, this pandemic has had a profound effect on learning and disengagement and student dropout and teacher burnout. How should policymakers continue to work to mitigate these effects that the pandemic has left us with?
Yes.
All three of you can answer that if you like.
Want me to start? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there's a lot of research showing this, that governments can work in trying to recover that loss. Many governments are extending the calendar year, so trying to adapt more days to the calendar year so students can recover classes, especially the most vulnerable students that lost more education and more learning because they didn't have access or didn't have connectivity. Some governments are adding some hours during the week, or are bringing some after-school programs to try to catch up. But I think that the key here is to understand that we need to recover that loss, especially for the most vulnerable communities in Latin America. They will never recover, and they might be losing 1 year or 2 years of schooling. So we need to work on that, and government should work on recovering that and not only improve quality of education for the future. No? Fernando.
I think we need to understand that public education is undergoing the most serious crisis in its history since public schools were invented. And that solving this crisis is going to require a whole of society effort. Now, I think that we have good experience to draw on. In the United States, for example, in the 1990s, I remember a bipartisan initiative, I believe it was under the presidency of George Bush Sr., that involved the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, our two main teacher unions, and our main technology companies, where they understood that technology was going to fundamentally transform the opportunity to participate economically and civically. And the result of that effort was something called the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, an unprecedented effort. I saw its impact in my state, in Massachusetts, helping our states to understand that we had to broaden our view of the competencies that students needed to develop. I think that examples like that tell us what the road forward is. The road forward is to come together for the future of the nation and of democracy itself in a bipartisan way, understanding that this is going to require not only a whole of government effort, but is going to require the private sector. It's going to require civil society. It's going to require our teacher unions, and exercise what is known as collective leadership for the interest of the children. Right now, as we speak, as the United Nations meet on the 77th General Assembly, the Secretary General of the UN has convened a global summit on education. And this summit, which will begin this weekend, is precisely designed to place education at the center of the agenda of societies, not just of governments, but of societies, recognizing that the enormous challenges that we're facing, the challenges of democratic backsliding, the challenge of social fragmentation, the challenge of increasing conflict within nations and across nations, the challenge of growing poverty, inequality, and of climate change, none of those challenges can be addressed without education as a bedrock, at the cornerstone of building those. So I think the answer to your very good question, Mr. Chairman, is the way in which policymakers can lead is facilitating a coalition, a multi-stakeholder coalition of all the forces of society to come together to support children and youth in their learning, because nothing less than the future of societies as we know them is at stake.
Thank you.
I would agree with the last part of what Mr. Reimers was saying, but I would like to add that we have to take into consideration that the importance of education should be addressed in a team way. We cannot put, you referred to the burnout problem teachers are having. I've been following the reality here in the United States, where teachers are actually dropping from the profession, and we have in the States there is a teacher shortage because of this, and I think that is because we put all of the pressure in education and none of the teamwork in education. Teachers are responsible for this very important relationship between the student and the school, but they are also people who need to be seen as part of a team. And if policymakers don't create regulations and laws that foster that ecosystem of teamwork between families, schools, and the state and the private sector, making education a social issue, an everyday social issue, we are not going to have good results in the near future. And I think that's the point in what Fernando was saying about this coalition should be not about policing and controlling, but about teamwork and a virtuous circle of better education for everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you this question on behalf of the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He asked me to ask you this question. How has the pandemic impacted learning loss in marginalized communities, particularly indigenous Afro-descendants, students with disabilities? How can we address this gap? Sure.
That is the question of the hour. The pandemic has most significantly affected the most marginalized students because they experience not only the impact of deficient arrangements of their schools to reach them, but they also experience the greatest impact, health impact, economic impact of the pandemic. So in Latin America, as is the case in other places, the pandemic has increased inequality. In one study that we conducted of the Global Initiative, looking comparatively at how the pandemic had impacted students in 20 countries, the single conclusion is that the most important factors that mediated the impact of the pandemic on education were nationality and social class. Nationality, because the choices governments made a huge difference. If you carry a Finnish passport, a Portuguese passport, or a Singaporean passport, you are impacted significantly less than if you carry an American passport, a Brazilian passport, a Mexican passport. Because in those countries, the choices that governments made or actually did not protect, in particular, the education of the most vulnerable students. And the second factor is social class, because as the pandemic moved the responsibility for education to the home, the enormous differences in the home circumstances of teachers played an even greater role than they normally do. So I think that is the priority of the moment, is to concentrate our efforts in those students who are most vulnerable, who are today furthest behind than they used to be from their peers.
Well, I am very interested in this topic. Obviously, my wife spent 37 years in education. So did I, unfortunately. And I want to thank you for being flexible with the time today. And the reason we did that is because we have, obviously, votes and things that are going, and you've been very kind to be flexible and not abandoning me. So I thank you. I thank you very much. I will now proceed to closing the hearing. Votes are going to be called in a while, so I thank you. Obviously, this is a topic that needs a lot of looking into. I think we're going to be impacted by the lack of, because of what COVID did to education in the next decade or more. And we have to keep an eye on how our students are progressing that have fallen behind. Not only here, but obviously in the rest of the world, because the COVID impacted just about everybody. So I thank you, and I now move to close the hearing. Thank you.